Okay, hi, I'm Evelynn Hammonds. I am the Barbara Gutman Rosencrantz Professor of the History of Science and Professor of African and African American Studies. And I direct a project on race and gender in science and medicine at the Hutchins Center here at Harvard. So how did I get into this topic? It really is both a professional and a personal story. I thought of myself as sort of preparing to become a scientist, but I have to say, at some point during my studies in physics at MIT, I just became profoundly concerned about the fact that there weren't very many people who looked like me doing this work. Mm-hmm. And the questions surrounding that, why weren't there more people like me doing this work, becoming a scientist, studying physics, became something that was really more important to me than actually doing physics. So I decided that I really wanted to try to work on understanding why American science, and you can include medicine in that as well, was so homogeneous. When I came to the History of Science department to studying for my PhD, I knew that I wanted to, that at some point I had to focus on trying to understand this question. And when I decided to do my work on my first book, which is about the control of diphtheria in New York City in the late 19th century, one of the things I wanted to understand in that book was how laboratory science was translated into clinical medicine and then into public health. So I wanted to understand scientific ideas moving through different contexts, and bacteriology is something that sort of spanned both medicine and biology. And so I found myself able to sort of learn about how you write about those kinds of ways in which knowledge travels across different domains. And I did that to prepare myself to really focus then very hard on the issues of race and gender in science and medicine.
We're wondering in what context you think we should look at sort of and take into consideration when writing on the history of race in medicine, in medicine and then the history of medicine, because there's a lot of there's layers and factors as you mentioned, but what are some of the most important?
So I think the most important things when you begin to try to do this history is to be very clear that race does not mean the same thing over time. And you have to pay attention to the changing concepts of race and context of race, especially in the U.S. context. Okay, so what people tend to do is think that something called scientific racism or medical racism is this one thing that persists over time. You start with Samuel Cartwright in 1851, and he's writing about drapetomania and black that the slaves had, running away disease, and those kind. And people think that stands for all time. That is that kind of particular kind of racial ideology that he was enacting in that work or about the treatments of slaves that he encountered is something that remains the same in medical practice over time. It does not. So, but we use the same word to talk about these things over time, sort of medical racism, institutional racism, but you have to be very specific about the context because race is something that is a concept that is very, one way to say it is, it's something that actually makes the social natural and the natural social. And I say that because we live in a country that's been completely defined by our racial hierarchies. And those hierarchies, again, don't remain the same over time, but some things persist. And one of the things that persists that you have to pay attention to is how difference is thought about, how the biological differences between human groups are thought about in the U.S. in particular. The question about difference in the U.S. doesn't ever go away. So that's why you can have a problem right now, and people will report on it, and they'll say, well, blacks have higher rates of this than whites. And we are so used to seeing that story. Right. We see it across, in disease cases. We see it on different technologies. We see it in so many ways. But, it's not one thing. It's not one thing. It's many things. And race and racial differences are produced in different ways over time. So the issue for me is that you have to really pay attention to context. You have to really think about doing the history in, I think, the best possible way, that is really asking deep and hard questions, looking very clearly at the evidence.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's a good conversation.